That was created by their oppressors. But as early as 1881, Edmund Wilmot Blyden, the great West Indian scholar and benefactor of West Africa, addressed himself to this situation when he said, this is 1881 now, this is his inaugural address at the Liberia College. And if you listen to it, you'll find out that this man in 1881 was ahead of most of the black scholars of today. He would go on to have a great career and to write a classic work that would do well to read today called Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. He says during this speech, in all English-speaking countries, the mind of the intelligent Negro child revolts against the deceptions and the distortions given in elementary books and geographies and travels and in history. Having embraced or at least ascended to the falsehoods about himself, he concludes that his only hope is to be those things most unlike himself and most alien to his peculiar taste. He goes on to say that one of our great tragedies is that we have spent too much time feeding grist into other people's meals. Then he bemoans, nothing comes out except what has been put in, and that then is our great sorrow. What this man was telling us in 1884 is that we have to reclaim ourselves and our own heritage and the nature of our history. He would go on and he would be the teacher of Africans, and he was the mentor of some of the early black nationalists in Western Africa. And of course, he would write many books. He was the first person to use the word African personality. He wrote a work on African socialism in 1901. He was the first person to champion the unification of Africa during that period, especially West Africa. He entered into a famous debate between Sir Harry Johnson and himself over the religious destiny of Africa, Islam or Christianity. He was of the opinion that Islam would be better for Africa because it was more adaptable to prevailing African ways of life. Then he qualified this, and his qualification need to be looked at today. He said, if the African understood the dynamic qualities of indigenous African religions, he would need neither Christianity or Islam. That's more true today than it was then. Black people have a tendency to get hung up on outside inputs. Now, I am not conceding Islam to the Arabs, and I am not conceding Christianity to white people. I know that we nursed both of these religions in their cradle, and we played a major role in bringing not only this religion into being, but all known religions into being. Because the first salvation-oriented religions the world can trace came out of Africa. And all religions are salvation-oriented. So therefore, the very idea, the very germ, the very genesis of world religions came out of Africa. No, I am not conceding Islam to the Arabs. I am conceding the Arabs' interpretation to him. I am conceding the Europeans' interpretation to Christianity to the European. Because once the European took over this religion for political reasons and began to use it as a political instrument and almost as a framework of his nationalism, Christianity died and Christendom was born. And there's a difference between Christianity and Christendom. Christendom is a political weapon. Christianity is a religious way of life. And for Christendom to come into being and to kill Christianity, then Christendom had to violate every rule that governs Christianity. Had to justify the slave trade, had to justify the monstrosity of the colonial system, It had to justify the demeaning of people. It had to rewrite the history of the world, glorifying Europe at the expense of other people. This is Christendom. And Christendom is forming a task that is anti-Christianity. Now, when this baby called Christianity left its cradle in North Africa and in the Middle East and went over to Europe and was used for political reasons, it was no longer our baby. And when they bring him home and sell him to us, they're selling us something which is alien in its present interpretation to our context. Because if they understood, and this is what Blyden was trying to get across, when you understand indigenous African religions and the binding nature of that religion, you will understand that these religions are basically Christian religions, and that there is nothing in Christianity, in moral law, that isn't already in those indigenous African religions. They never say that I am my brother's keeper, but they keep their brother. They don't preach about it, but they do it. If a young brother dies and he has a wife and children, the older brother takes care. He don't cry about it, gets a little help, but he automatically takes over. It's part of the law that governs the whole society. No homes for the aged, because nobody discards their mother. No homes for the abandoned children, because nobody abandons children. And up until recently, no insane asylums, because nobody went insane. Because the protective mechanism was built into the society itself. Now, with the coming of the Europeans to West Africa, with the misunderstanding of the Christian elements of indigenous African religions, and with imposing Christendom on Africa in violation of Christianity, African societies would suffer. But now we're going to have to look back now at the genesis of the blacks in the New World. And that genesis has to deal with looking at the rise of Europe and the consequences of history involved in that rise. You're going to have to look at what I have been referring to as Europe's evil genius. And that evil genius of Europe began to develop after the Crusade period. The European had developed certain basic technology, principally the gun, not to kill any African or Asian, but to protect himself from himself, but to protect themselves from each other. And the weaponry that the European had developed in Europe to protect himself from other Europeans, once that family dispute was partly settled, that weaponry was used to expand into the broader world. And the Christian story, which he did not buy for himself, about meekness and turning the other cheek, he would go out now and sell it to certain people naive enough to buy it, because the same elements were embedded into his indigenous way of life. And something fell apart. Certain things were misread in history. Now let's look at the consequences of that rise, because this is what would bring the African to the New World. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, fortunately for Europe, unfortunately for Africa, when Europe began to shake off the power and the hold of African domination of the Mediterranean, and I'm using my words well, because that domination of Spain that the Arabs take so much credit for was military African from the beginning. The original conquest of Spain was an African conquest, and a black African conquest at that. And Haile Bourguiba's work, called Tariq Ben Zayed, named after the black general from Mauritania and Senegal who went up to Morocco and organized the force that conquered Spain In this eyewitness account, he says, the army was as black as ink. The general was blacker still.